I hate to break it to you, but not every secondhand shop is a thrift store. Hi, my name is Riley. I make vintage clothing and small business content, and today we're going to talk about the different types of secondhand shops. I made a short summarizing this with what I considered the 5 main categories of secondhand shops. Kind of popped off. I love my fans. I was really excited to see the commentary and the conversation that was happening in the comments of that short because a lot of you flagged that that was really an overview. There are so many other types of secondhand shops than the 5 that I highlighted in that short. So today we're going to break down in more detail the different types of secondhand shops. We've got thrift stores and rag houses / Goodwill bins. We've got consignment shops. We've got buy sell trade shops, curated vintage shops, antique malls. But then we've also got other ways to shop secondhand that aren't necessarily shops, like garage sales, estate sales, discount stores like Ross or TJ Maxx or Home Goods, which aren't necessarily secondhand, but you can still get a good deal and that inventory is unpredictable. So we're gonna go through all of those differences today. You might be asking, does this even matter? Who cares? And those are valid questions. And to that I say, I care. And I think it matters to an extent. Obviously, there are things in the world that matter more than specific word choice when labeling what type of shop you're going to. But I do think having an understanding of what these differences are can help prevent sticker shock in the future. If you think you're going thrifting, but you walk into a vintage shop, that sticker shock and that price difference might be a little disarming. So having that base understanding and base expectation of what you're going to get into when you go to one of these shops can maybe help a customer down the line. I also think it helps set expectations if you're somebody who wants to go thrifting. If a friend approaches you with a really cool leather jacket and you're like, oh my God, where did you get that? And they say, oh, I thrifted it. But in reality, they got it from a vintage shop. Having that shared understanding of the differences can help prevent disappointment if now you're thinking, oh, I'm gonna go to that same thrift store where they got that jacket and find something similar when you're probably not going to because maybe that vintage shop got it from an estate sale or got it abroad or wherever else they do their sourcing. That's kind of in the weeds. Short answer is, I think it's interesting, so I'm gonna talk about it. Long answer is, I'm making this video to help level set expectations, help provide understanding of what the different shops are, and maybe give you some new ideas for where you can shop secondhand in the future. I also hope this video encourages you to shop secondhand because there are so many options. I know that not everyone likes thrifting. It can be really gross, just saying. It can be unpredictable. You have to do a lot of digging. It can require a lot of time, but there are other alternatives to find cool secondhand vintage pieces that are not in a thrift store. So if this topic sounds interesting to you, now would be a great time to go ahead and like this video and subscribe to my channel. And let me know in the comments below your favorite way to shop secondhand. I'm always looking for a good recommendation. So let's start with thrift stores. Thrift stores are usually what you think of when we're talking about shopping secondhand. What I like to call capital T proper thrift stores are your shops like Goodwill, Salvation Army, Savers, and then some charity shops within that, or thrift stores that have a nonprofit lens are your St. Vincent de Paul, Cause for Paws in Raleigh, or your rescue mission shops. Overall, your thrift stores are gonna have a variety of merchandise, very unpredictable. It's going to be everything from fast fashion to some vintage finds if you're lucky, but you're gonna have to do a lot of digging. Usually, thrift stores have their inventory set at a lower price point than any other secondhand shop. Now I know Goodwill has raised their prices a lot recently, so depending on what region you're in, you might not be getting the deal you think you're gonna get. I totally understand that. A lot of the shops in North Carolina, at least, a lot of the Goodwills in North Carolina at least, are usually around $5 an item. So I do consider that a thrift store, but it really does depend on where you're located. I will also mention that this video is going to be specific to the United States. I know that charity shops carry a different meaning in the UK versus the US. So if I'm talking about charity shops or talking about nonprofit thrift stores, and you're like, that is not the case where I live, I'm so sorry. I live in the United States, so I'm going to talk about the shops in the United States, but I would love to hear what the difference is in your country. So let me know in the comments. I would love to learn. But charity shops in the United States basically are nonprofit thrift stores in the United States, or thrift stores that have a nonprofit mission attached to them. Technically, on paper, that is Goodwill. Goodwill's mission is to provide work readiness and interview prep and resume help to folks who otherwise had barriers to entry for the workforce. So that is their mission. However, Goodwill kind of sucks as a corporation. Some of the loudest criticism criticism that you'll see is connected to the CEO paying himself a ridiculous salary for somebody who runs a nonprofit. The prices have also increased a lot in the last couple of years, which just reeks of greediness, especially when you've got a CEO that pays himself the salary he does. And most recently, we've seen that Goodwill employees, depending on the region, have a binder full of brands that they pull off the floor, so don't allow customers to buy firsthand and instead ship off to corporate to sell for higher prices. That is icky because they got these items for free because Goodwill operates on a donation basis to receive their inventory. So Goodwill is not my first choice of mission-driven thrift stores, but according to the definition I've laid out with lower price point, unpredictable inventory, and secondhand goods, Goodwill is a thrift store. Better charity shops / nonprofit shops that I can recommend to you in the North Carolina area are going to be St. Vincent de Paul. Actually, I don't even know if there are any in North Carolina, but I have shopped at some in Florida, and the ones that I've shopped at in Florida, I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, the mission is to support women who came from situations with domestic violence or women's shelters in general. That's a great cause to support. And then Cause for Paws in Raleigh is another great one. They are connected to an animal shelter, so helping support animal adoption and animal rescue work. Now is also a great time, I think, to mention the rescue mission shops in North Carolina. There's the Winston-Salem Rescue Mission, there's the Durham Rescue Mission, run by different people, but both share the similarity of having Christian ministry tied into their mission. I've had great experiences at the Winston-Salem Rescue Mission. I don't know if they have any issues behind the scenes like the Durham Rescue Mission does, but I will get to that in a second. The Winston-Salem Rescue Mission supports people who have struggled with addiction or just overall have needs related to housing, food, shelter, and usually have a Christian counseling tied into their efforts. Their prices are really affordable. The people who work there are really nice. Overall, as a customer there, I've had 10 out of 10 experience. Cannot say the same for Durham Rescue Mission. I want to be nuanced in how I talk about this, so if I'm stumbling over the words or just don't sound super sure of myself, it's because I'm not super sure of myself, but this is something I want to mention because I do think it's important to consider where you're shopping and who you're giving your money to. And the Durham Rescue Mission has had a lot of controversy in the last couple of years related to how they treat their workers and really how they exploit their workers. The Assembly wrote a really good article about the Durham Rescue Mission a couple years ago that I'll show here and then link in the description as well, so you can do some reading and get the full story. But the Durham Rescue Mission has a history of not paying their workers very much, requiring them to volunteer for little to no money, but doing work that requires pay, and then oftentimes also requiring their workers to participate in their Christian religious practices that may or may not conflict with that individual's personal identity or personal religious choices. Unfortunately, a case where the religious ties are really overshadowing the nonprofit mission of supporting people in need or helping people overcome addiction. That is the overview. I don't want to get too off topic, but just wanted to flag that I know the Durham Rescue Mission is a really notable nonprofit shop in the Triangle in North Carolina, but wanted to make sure that y'all had all the information and know that there are some other options out there if you want to shop at a nonprofit specifically. I'll also clarify here that charity shops are kind of a subsection of thrift stores. So charity shops are thrift stores, but not every thrift store is a charity shop. Next up, we've got rag houses and the Goodwill bins. Yes, they're different. Yes, I'm clumping them into the same category just for convenience because I want to draw a couple comparisons to them. The Goodwill bins are different from Goodwill retail shops. I know, we're getting into it now. Typically, the Goodwill bins get their inventory from retail shops and the inventory that did not sell on the floor at retail shops. So kind of like leftovers from the Goodwill shops that have racks, and Goodwill bins get their inventory from the donations that never even made it out onto the floor at the Goodwill retail shops. I know. Fun fact for you, only 10 to 20% of donated goods ever end up on the floor in a thrift store. Crazy. So the Goodwill bins are another destination for those donated items that either didn't sell in the store or never even made it into the store. And Goodwill bins are even more rummagey, digging for treasure than a thrift store. They come out in big bales at a time. Typically, if you're in a strict Goodwill, nobody is allowed to touch the bins until the workers say, all right, go for it. You're released. The key difference here is this is most likely going to be the cheapest option you find for secondhand shopping because everything is pay by the pound. If my information is up to date, I believe it's $1.29 per pound of clothing at the Goodwill bins local to me. And then there's a different price for hardware like toys, books, media, etc. But definitely the most rummaging you'll have to do to shop secondhand and the cheapest price you'll probably find for shopping secondhand. In the short that I made on this topic, I mentioned that thrift stores were the last stop before the landfill for a lot of these items. And somebody called me out because that's not entirely accurate, but I abbreviated for the sake of the short's time limit. But I will offer more clarification here. Sometimes, yes, the items that don't sell from the Goodwill bins do go directly to landfills, but most of the time, the items that don't sell at the Goodwill bins or don't sell in the Goodwill retail stores actually get packaged up and shipped abroad to then become other countries' problems, which is crazy and just another reason to shop secondhand because there is so much waste and so much textile already out in existence that like we can't even sustain it in our own countries. However, most of the time they already have an extreme excess of textile waste and clothing in their own countries, so they're left to either deal with it and have these massive piles for people to sift through and shop, or they burn the clothing, which creates really poor living and air conditions in those countries and obviously is very harmful to the environment as well. There are so many really good resources to learn more about this topic. I really like the Clothes Horse podcast, so I will link that in the description as well if you want to learn more about what happens to clothing that doesn't sell in the thrift stores. Just wanted to further explain where exactly that clothing goes. Now, rag houses. They are similar to the Goodwill bins and that rag houses are also a pay by the pound secondhand shop. However, there are not very many rag houses in the United States. The ones that I can think of that are closest to me in North Carolina, there's a rag house in Atlanta and a rag house in Philadelphia. Rag houses are really cool because the people who work in rag houses typically have already sorted through all of the items. They get them from places like the bins or they get them from other last stop before the landfill clothing situations, and usually those workers sort them by decade or sort them by textile type. But the caveat is that usually rag houses are by appointment only and or you have to have a reseller's license to shop at these places. They're not available to everyone and they're really geared towards folks who are going to be reselling the clothing and have a business of rehoming. And they also have a price minimum. Typically, you usually have to commit to spending at least $500 or $1,000 before you even start shopping there. So another one that's not accessible to everyone, but usually a little bit more affordable for vintage business owners and clothing that you would not be able to find otherwise. Now let's talk about garage sales and estate sales. These are not brick and mortar shops, okay? Garage sales, you probably know what a garage sale is. It is an individual, informal sale usually set up in somebody's front yard or in their driveway where a family or an individual person is looking to just do a brief clean out and get rid of stuff from their house. Prices are all over the place, okay? I've been to some garage sales where one thing those people do have, the audacity. I'm talking like $20 for a pair of jeans. Man, these are Target jeans. But then you have garage sales where you're getting clothing for 25 cents and people just want that stuff out of their house. These are so unpredictable and I feel like they're popping up a little bit more and more in terms of popularity, recession indicator probably, but very unpredictable inventory, very unpredictable prices, very unpredictable customer service that you're going to be dealing with. And usually the best way to find these is just by seeing a sign and driving by it and seeing them pop up. However, usually people post about them on Facebook or there's an app called Garage Sale Map. Not my favorite option, but it definitely exists. Similarly, but different, we have estate sales. Estate sales happen when somebody is selling usually almost all of the belongings in their house at once versus a garage sale where it's like a little bit of furniture here, a little bit of clothing here, and everything can fit in the front yard. Estate sales usually occur when a family or an individual is looking to get rid of items due to a downsizing or a move or a death in the family, and they usually hire out a company to go through the house and price everything for them and run the sale for them. Because of that, prices are going to be a little higher. Estate sale prices can also be unpredictable because it depends on the company that's running the sale and it depends on how much stuff is in the house and how collectible the items are. The companies that are running the sale usually take a cut of the overall profits, which is how they make their money. And sometimes people know what they got and sometimes people don't. I've been to many estate sales in my time, and sometimes I need to take a break from them. I love estate sales because you really can find some great collectible once in a lifetime pieces, but at what cost, you know? Because I will say people are cutthroat at estate sales, like other customers. Usually how estate sales work, you find the sale, usually through either Facebook Marketplace or estatesales.net, which is a great resource if you want to shop an estate sale. In the listing, you see when the sale starts and what day the sale starts. Typically, there's a sign-up list connected to an estate sale. So the description on the estatesales.net page will say, the sale starts at 9. We're gonna have a sign-up list starting at 8 a.m. We're not gonna give out the first number until 8 a.m. So then people will line up as early as like midnight if it's a crazy sale. More realistically, like 6:30 a.m., 7 a.m. if there's something they really want. They will line up at 6:30 a.m. to get in line for the sign-up sheet. And then once they're on the sign-up sheet, you can go and then come back at 9. But people are lining up hours before. Sometimes the line is unofficial. Like sometimes people are just sitting in their cars holding their spot. Don't get me started on that, but that's how it usually goes. Okay, that's the unspoken rule. If you're in your car first and you're parked outside the house and it's 6:30 a.m., technically you're number one in line. I don't really agree with that. I think if you want to get in line, you get out of your car and you are at the front step. That's how you get your spot, not by sitting in your car, but that's besides the point. That usually initiates the line. Once you got your number, you come back. It's 8:55 a.m. People are in number order because they've gotten their numbers and they let you into the house. People are running in that house. They're throwing elbows. They're gonna push you out of the way to get to the Tiffany lamp that they want or to get to the oak dresser that they want. You will get knocked down. I think at least once in your life, if you are somebody that ends up going to estate sales very frequently, you will have a little old lady push you. That is a rite of passage, I fear. And sometimes I can't take that. Like I'll go to an estate sale, I'll have the adrenaline rush of getting there early and getting the stuff that I wanted and no little old lady being mean to me. I'll have that twice in a row. I'll have 2 sales that are really good. And then I'll do 3. I'll have 3 really great sales. And then I'll get to the 4th sale of this season or this year. And I'll just have the worst experience because somebody was mean to me or somebody cared more about getting a lamp or a dress than they did about being nice to a stranger. And that just ruins it for me for a while, you know? At the end of the day, it's just stuff. And sometimes going to an estate sale where people care so much more about stuff than they do about being nice, I just can't deal with that. All that to say, estate sales, you can find some great stuff, but also at estate sales, you can deal with some of the most horrible, entitled people, all because you wanted a dresser. One last note about estate sales before I move on. Once you go to an estate sale that you like, usually the organizer will have a newsletter or like a QR code for their website set up at the checkout table. You should sign up for their newsletter if you liked that estate sale experience and you thought they had good prices, because then you can find out directly from the organizers what other sales they're doing in your area. So just a little tip there. Let's move on to consignment shops. Consignment shops and buy-sell trade shops usually get confused. So I'm going to break it down for you. Consignment shops sell items on behalf of an individual, but the key here is that those individuals do not get paid until their item sells. Consignment shops usually have a little nicer quality items than a thrift store, and the price usually sits somewhere between thrift and retail. Again, this is going to depend on the store that you go to and where you're located. This is my experience in North Carolina. Some examples of consignment shops are Thrift Pony in Charlotte, don't be confused by the name, and the Snob Shop in Winston-Salem, and Coco's Corner in Greensboro. If you consign your items to one of these shops, you usually get a cut of the sale. That's how the business works. I just consigned some items to Thrift Pony for the first time to see how their consignment process worked, and it was super easy. I brought a bag of items to their shop, had a 30-minute appointment. They looked through all the items, took about 30, and Thrift Pony is very generous in that they do a 50-50 split for the most part with their consigners. So if they price an item for $10, the person who brought that item in will get $5. That's how Thrift Pony makes their money. They have that $5 profit. That is a very fair cut for consignment shops. Usually consignment shops will do 60-40. Usually it's a lot of modern, but like more upscale modern brands. And this is not exclusive to Thrift Pony, but a lot of consignor shops. The most important thing to note about consignment shops and what makes them a consignment shop is the fact that the person who brought the item in does not get paid until that item sells. That is not to be confused with buy-sell trade shops. Buy-sell trade shops pay individuals directly for the items, and then they sell the items on the floor after that individual has already been paid. Buy-sell trade shops usually purchase more trendy items directly from the individual, and then will essentially resell it on their behalf. You can get cash or store credit, and some examples of buy sell trade shops are going to be Plato's Closet, Uptown Cheapskate, Style Encore, or Rumors if you're in Chapel Hill or Durham. Again, these prices are going to sit somewhere in between thrift and retail. Think like between $10 and $20 for an item. And I know what you're gonna say, retail, like that's what I pay for retail. When I say retail, I'm talking about mall brands. I know that clothing is so inexpensive if you're shopping at places like Walmart or Target or Amazon or Shein. That is not the retail price I'm talking about. I'm thinking of like one-to-one price comparison. So a pair of jeans at Free People, that's like $100. If you get a pair of Free People jeans from Thrift Pony or from Plato's Closet, they're going to be more in the $20 range. So that is what I mean when I say it's going to be less expensive than retail, but more expensive than a thrift store. One last note about buy sell trade shops. They usually offer you the choice between store credit and cash. You'll usually get more of a percentage if you choose store credit and slightly less of a cut if you choose cash. Now let's talk about curated vintage shops, my personal favorite. Curated vintage shops are usually run by an individual or a collective of individuals working together to source their items on their own. They're sorting items and curating items according to era, style, textile. They're offering their expertise and their personal knowledge as part of their services. So you're paying for that curation, the condition of the garment, and their knowledge, not just the clothing. In North Carolina, this is going to be places like the Durham Vintage Collective, which is technically multiple individual curators sharing a shop, Gibson Girl Vintage, Flying Apple Vintage, House of Rebellion in Raleigh, Rat's Nest in Charlotte, and Still Grimy or Off the Rack in Winston-Salem. They're all a little different in terms of style and in price, but generally the prices are going to be somewhere in between a little less than retail and a little more than retail, depending on the item that you're looking at. This is another area where I kind of got gotcha'd in the comments of my short. So I wanted to clarify again what my scope is for retail when I say that something is going to be cheaper or more expensive than retail. Let's talk about a brand like Banana Republic, for example. At Banana Republic, leather jackets go for like between $300 and $500 retail. If you find a leather jacket at a curated vintage shop, they're usually going to be around $100. That is significantly less than retail. However, you might be thinking of jeans from Target. Jeans from Target are $20, give or take. Jeans at a curated vintage shop might be $40 plus or somewhere around the $40 range. And that's because of the quality that you're getting and the uniqueness of the garment. Jeans from Target are usually not 100% cotton. The jeans that you find at a curated vintage shop are usually going to be 100% cotton because that's almost exclusively how jeans were made in the 80s and 90s. You're also going to be finding pieces that are a little bit more unique. All of the jeans in Target are mass produced, and if you buy a pair of jeans from Target, chances are you're gonna see somebody out on the street wearing the same exact pair. Nothing wrong with that, but if you're wanting something that nobody else has or that is a little bit more special or unique, you go to a vintage shop and you find a pair of jeans that has a really unique wash or has really unique pleating or a cool yoke on the back. You're going to pay a premium for that kind of specialty. I could do a whole video that goes into the pricing of curated vintage, so let me know if you would be interested in that, because I feel like it really is a science and there's a lot that goes into it that folks may not know. As a subset of curated vintage shops, there are vintage collectives, which are multiple vintage businesses in the same shop in a very intentional way. So this is going to be your Durham Vintage Collective in Durham, your Fallback Vintage in Raleigh, or the Borough in Raleigh as well. Now is a good time for us to talk about the depop of it all. Thinking of marketplaces like Depop, eBay, Poshmark, Mercari, Vinted, and Etsy. These are basically curated vintage shops, but online. However, each app definitely has a different connotation. You could find high prices or low prices on any of these platforms because sometimes you'll have people who know exactly what they have, and sometimes you have people who just want to do a closet clean out and get rid of things really quickly. However, you'll also have a lot of modern clothing mixed into the inventory. It's not exclusive to vintage. It's a little easier than thrifting because you're not digging as much. However, you will have to dig through the massive amounts of listings that have just junk tags thrown in there that oversaturate your search results. So it can be a little bit difficult to find exactly what you're looking for, but it's definitely easier than going to a Goodwill and sifting through all the racks. Now let's talk about how each app differs from one another. Depop is definitely the most curated vintage app of all the options, but they focus more on 90s and early 2000s, even some streetwear styles. Poshmark, you're usually going to find some more modern pieces. It's definitely got a more closet clean out connotation to it, but if you're lucky, a lot of those modern finds will be slightly below retail cost. eBay has both auction and buy it now options, but keywords and cores like cottage core, fairy core, they don't apply as much here. You're going to need to know exactly what you're looking for and use the most objective keywords possible. Vinted is another more streetwear, 90s through early 2000s option. I will say I have not personally shopped on Vinted, so I can't speak for the quality of options there or how easy it is to shop there, but it is an option if you're interested. Whatnot is an auction style app. Items range from $5 up, really depending on the seller. Sometimes they'll do exclusively $5 starts, so $5 minimum for any item, and you can get a lot of steals because it is time sensitive and in that auction format. But it's really a mixed bag because it is a live stream and you're in the moment. You don't know exactly what you're going to get, so it can be really unpredictable. You're also going to find both vintage and modern items on Whatnot, and there are a lot of other collector bases on Whatnot, not just vintage clothing. You can find sports cards, sneakers, video games, a little bit of everything. Etsy is also more curated vintage, but you can find a lot of antiques and collectibles here, usually carrying a higher price tag than places like Poshmark or Depop, but there the sellers know exactly what they have and you're getting that curated, usually very well maintained item. And lastly, Mercari. This is another more affordable option in my experience, but Mercari has better options for collectibles like toys and media and fandom items, more so than vintage clothing. You can find vintage clothing there occasionally, but that's not the go-to app for vintage clothing. Now, very similar to vintage collectives, but still different, are antique malls. Antique malls are large spaces with individual vendor booths inside the space. So think of it like 100 individual curated shops with their own rent and floor plan essentially inside one big warehouse. The items in antique malls are going to vary vendor to vendor, and that includes price point and quality, but usually antique malls focus more on collectibles and older items. At least that's how antique malls have been identified historically. Unfortunately, with the rise of AI slop and mass-produced items, a lot of antique malls have some booths that have just been like overrun with the same junk that maybe is supposed to look like collectible antique items, but are not, instead are brand new or mass-produced. Definitely go into antique malls with some realistic expectations, knowing that not everything you see in there is going to be vintage or secondhand. But if the owners of the antique malls are selective enough in the vendors who they allow to be there, usually those mass-produced items will be at a minimum. Some of my favorite antique malls in North Carolina, where I have not seen any of the mass-produced slop, so I can vouch for these personally, are going to be Sleepy Poet in Charlotte, Cheshire Cat and Trunk Show in Raleigh, and Design Archives in Greensboro and Winston-Salem. I actually used to have a booth at the Design Archives in Winston-Salem. I had a booth there for 5 years and just moved out in December 2025. It was such a great experience. I love everybody who works there and all of my fellow vendors are so nice. It was a really good experience, but I live in Durham now, so I could not maintain driving an hour and a half to go restock my booth every 2 weeks or every month. So unfortunately, I just couldn't maintain it. But if you're ever in Winston-Salem or in Greensboro, you should definitely check out both locations. Another subsection of the curated vintage shop, we've got vintage markets versus flea markets versus swap meets. Let's start with the vintage market. This is basically a curated vintage shop outside in a 10 by 10 tent, and there happen to be 20 to 25 of them all in one place. It's the vibes of a curated vintage shop with the square footage typically of an antique mall. Again, the price point and the quality are going to vary from vendor to vendor. Each tent is its own business. Each tent and each business has their own style, their own voice, their own price point. Some of them are exclusively t-shirts. Sometimes those t-shirts are on a big pile on the ground and not on the racks. And then right next to that big pile of t-shirts, you're gonna have the cutest, most girly pop, fairy, Y2K tint you've ever seen, and they're complete 180s to one another, but they're right next to each other. So again, it's a mixed bag. The price point is gonna be usually a little similar to a curated vintage shop. In my opinion, it should be lower because most of these businesses at a vintage market do not have brick and mortar shops. Usually people who are selling at vintage markets sell almost exclusively online, except for these once a month or a couple times a month outdoor vintage markets. The vintage markets are slightly different from flea markets in the type of items that are being sold. Vintage markets carry the connotation of being almost exclusively clothing with some accessories and homewares thrown in there. Flea markets carry the connotation of being mostly homewares, decorative items, accessories with some clothing thrown in there. I will also say that flea markets usually carry the connotation of being a little bit cheaper than vintage markets, a little bit more affordable, and there's usually a lot more room to haggle at a flea market than at a vintage market, especially if the items are not priced individually. So to clarify, if the items are priced individually, like at a vintage market, usually the seller might be a little bit more firm in their pricing versus a flea market. There are usually deals like buy 5 rings and get a discount, or buy 10 mugs and get a discount, or however much quantity discount you want to apply. Now, flea markets and vintage markets are different from swap meets. Swap meets are outdoor events centered on trading instead of selling. It's usually more community driven than sales driven in terms of vintage market versus swap meet. It's usually less about professional selling. So this is more of like your Facebook marketplace buy nothing group personified outside. Lastly, we've got a little bonus category. Let's talk about the TJ Maxx Ross type stores. I got a lot of comments on my short asking where those types of stores fall into this secondhand shop dictionary. So we're going to talk about it. Shops like TJ Maxx and Ross get their inventory from overstock or off-price retail brands. These items are not necessarily secondhand because they are brand new. The discount price you're getting is from excess inventory, not the secondhand nature. From my perspective, these types of shops are not secondhand, but they are really good bargain stores. You can find a good deal, and I consider them kind of a gateway to thrifting. If you're apprehensive about shopping secondhand or going to a thrift store, going to a shop like TJ Maxx or Ross can be a really nice introduction to some of the aspects of thrifting, like the unpredictability of the inventory or shopping for a discounted price. So if you're wanting to go thrifting but feel a little nervous, aren't ready to, I would suggest going to a shop like TJ Maxx or Ross, or going to a consignment shop or a buy-sell trade shop where the prices are lower but a little bit of hand selection has already happened. I think Thrift Pony in Charlotte, which is a consignment store, actually refers to themselves as like the gateway to thrifting because they have so much inventory at such an affordable cost, but they've already done a little bit of that hand selection with the modern and the trendy pieces that it can be a nice introduction to thrifting if you want to get there eventually. Or even if you don't want to get there and you don't want to have to do the digging yourself, all of these shops, the consignment, the buy-sell trade, and the discount shops like TJ Maxx and Ross, they can be good opportunities for you to shop secondhand without having to do that digging. So that was a lot of information. We talked about a lot of different shops today. I hope it was helpful, and I hope this breakdown makes sense and can maybe provide some inspiration for other ways to shop secondhand if you're interested. If you made it to the end of the video, let me know your favorite way to shop secondhand in the comments below, and let me know if you think I missed any categories. Thanks for sticking around, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye.